All right, folks. So today we're gonna be talking about poison. Basically, it was a Netflix documentary that was just recently released that discusses the different conditions that a lot of your food, whether it be meats, vegetables, other produce, whatnot, how they're grown, as well as some of the diseases they're susceptible with, and how they might not be safe for you to consume. So basically, this whole documentary starts out with the Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak that took place in the 1990s, I think 1992 and 1993. Now, this outbreak, which in the end infected hundreds of people as well as unalive about 4 people, including a 17-month-year-old boy at the time, Riley Ditweiler, which his family and his parents and all that were featured prominently in the film. And so one of the biggest things that came in the aftermath of this tragedy, basically they started to name E. coli, or the specific strain of E. coli, which is I think 0157. That strain, basically they decided to name it as an adulterant. Now, if you're not very sciencey or technical, basically an adulterant is a substance or a micropathogen or whatever, basically that ruins, spoils, or taints the quality of a meat product. Now, crazy enough, before this outbreak, E. coli, they weren't classified as adulterants, and basically they were just seen as a germ that usually animals carry that were harmful for us. But the thing about it was they were classified as pathogens that you can kill during a kill step. Basically, when you talk about a kill step, it means you cook it, you get the germs off, and you should be fine. And usually that will be okay with chicken as well as steak and all that, because usually you weren't mixing and matching different meats and stuff together. Basically, it was on the skin. But that wasn't the case with ground beef, because the thing with ground beef, the way it's made, they usually take a lot of different parts from a lot of different animals and basically just mush them all together. And so basically what you thought was the skin and what you thought was the guts and inside, all that gets churned up together. Now, if you're disgusted by that, don't worry. I was right there with y'all. I was literally eating chicken salad whenever I was watching this film, which is something I don't recommend. But in aftermath of this tragedy, they basically named E. coli an adulterant for ground beef, at least. And basically through that, they took the responsibility off of the consumer and put more of the onus on the producers, the manufacturers, the slaughterhouses, to make sure they can really get rid of the E. coli and really spot E. coli in bad batches before it gets out and shipped out to, the fast food restaurants, the grocery stores, the consumers, and all that. And while this really cut down on E. coli outbreaks that were found in ground beef, this didn't just, completely get rid of all outbreaks in general, because the next outbreak we're going to talk about, it happened in Yuma, Arizona. Now, Yuma, Arizona is one of 2 primary locations where leafy greens are grown in the U.S. and shipped out all across the U.S. to consumers. And this outbreak started because of runoff that came from cow manure that were infected with E. coli, got into the irrigation system that was used to treat the leafy greens that were then sent out across America. One of the victims that were highlighted during this is a girl named Stephanie, and basically she was on death's door. Like, she was this close to being unalive, but miraculously she made a grand recovery. And because she unfortunately ate one of these leafy greens, she is not only just looking at a kidney transplant, but she also looking at being on dialysis for the rest of her life. But in this part of the documentary, this is when they really get into the different aspects of how our industry is regulated, because when you have the USDA, basically they're just in charge of looking at meat and a few egg products, while the FDA is in charge of every other food project not covered under the USDA. And basically that means leafy greens, that means salads, that means cheese, that means a lot of other things. And while there's been many, many, many decades of laws, regulations, and wherewithal to really crack down on a lot of these outbreaks and contaminations, it is very difficult to enforce these laws because, for one, there is many different spheres of regulation that you can go into. Because while I said the FDA and USDA have different foods and stuff that they can, make recommendations and regulate, the local health departments are primarily in charge of the actual food establishments in case there's an outbreak that take place. And it gets pretty tricky in that end because if there's an outbreak, you got to figure out what's the source of the outbreak. Did it come from the greens? Did it come from the meat? Or was it just, from the restaurant? It gets tricky with that. And then once you really figure out where it came from, then you have to understand what are they in their powers to do to really enforce and regulate the laws to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And that goes to my next point in that, yes, if there's any laws that have been broken, whether it be local, state, or federal, that at the end of the day, they have a case to where they can prosecute them, they can sue them, they can have, civil litigation from the families and all that. But at the end of the day, they aren't able to have any more, federal oversight on the day-to-day operations of the farms, the hatcheries, or basically where the food is being produced because the law is set aside by Congress. And while this was stated in the documentary, I don't have the exact policy right here in front and presenting the video, I do want to mention the Hatch Act, which is basically a law that prevents any federal civil employee from participating in political activities in their capacity as a federal employee. And to really put it in a nutshell with the USDA and FDA, they explain it a little bit in the documentary, but basically they can't advocate on behalf of the FDA to say that we need more oversight in this industry or we need to have more laws in this industry because you're technically breaching the Hatch Act. And on this end, I can really understand that because I worked for the city once upon a time, and basically we could not advocate to Congress, we couldn't advocate to the president, we couldn't advocate to the vice president, we couldn't really advocate to anybody in the federal government because we as a federal agency will be breaking the Hatch Act if we did. And at the end of the day, it gets very frustrating because we're in year three and a half of the pandizzy, and at the end of the day, we can't really get the job that we need to get done as public health professionals. The next outbreak that they talk about in the documentary is the Leafy Green Outbreaks in 2006. Basically, 200 people were infected with E. coli, as well as the fact that 3 people unfortunately got unalived in this incident. And the main culprit was, you guessed it, prepackaged spinach that hailed from a farm in California that got infected with E. coli. And this was the incident that really spurred on the LGMA. Basically, this is called the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement, where it was a big collaboration from all the different leafy green producers, the CEO, coordinators, and all that, basically trying to make their own safety standards in a way that they thought would create faster responses than the federal government. But if you know anything about corporate America, basically what they mean by faster responses by the federal government, they mean cheaper and oftentimes rushed responses that makes them more money at the end of the day. But I digress. Now, in the aftermath of this, they basically highlighted a few different, aspects that they felt will really spur on outbreaks and try their best to limit these. They really try their best not to do anything effective when it comes to the, separation of operations or the proximity of operations and spare them out more. Because at the end of the day, like I said with corporate America, the best thing they're going to try and do is make as much money the cheapest way possible and call it efficiency when you putting more people's lives in danger. And so instead of trying to fix the root cause of the issue with the proximity, they try to make these band-aid issues such as hygiene as well as water contamination to make it look like they're doing something, but they're not getting rid of the main root cause that is really, putting people's lives in danger. And so this is why, a lot of people don't like the LGMA because it's just, but if you think the documentary was going to stop at that when it comes to exposing corporate greed, then you got nothing coming, because it really then goes into the, peanut salmonella outbreak that took place in 2009, where about 700 people were infected, as well as 6 people were unalived during this outbreak due to grotesque conditions by Steve Parnell, the CEO of Peanut Corp, as well as in their production plants, which had many different, things going on with it. They had leaky ceilings, basically bird, feces would get into the product, rat infestations, people getting sick. And one of the most egregious thing at all, they basically became so lax with the salmonella test, they either falsified the results when there was a positive test, keep testing the same batches of peanuts until a false test came up, then shipped the entire batch, and documented emails where there were known salmonella concerns and positive salmonella tests, but Parnell told them to ship it anyway. And this not only got people sick, but basically this caused about 40,000 different peanut products to be, recalled. I'm not talking about individual units. I'm talking about 45 different peanut brands, products, whatever, basically to get recalled and cost the economy about millions and millions of dollars. And while most American capitalists really probably don't care about people, the people aspect of it, they be danged if you don't let them mess with their money. And so basically they brought Steve up on charges and basically got him sentenced about 30 years in jail, which it should be a lot longer considering that people actually got unalived in this incident, but I digress. Another instance of corporate greed that this documentary talks about is the DeCoster incident. And basically 2010, there was a massive egg recall that hailed from the DeCoster farm produce plant, and it ended up not only getting about 56,000 Americans sick, but it ended up costing the economy about million dollars, as well as a total of about 500 million eggs were recalled. And not only was that the main incidents, but the DeCoster family farms has a history of not only just gross negligence to, hygiene, safety, and all that, but basically racism against workers, poor living conditions for workers, as well as, pay disparities in workers, among a lot of other different issues that was going on at the farm and with this whole family. But the sad tragedy about the situation is that corporate greed won out again, and basically they got about 3 months in jail because I think they signed a plea deal as well. But at the end of the day, they really did the public an injustice because that is not nearly enough time for getting, oogles of people sick, as well as costing the economy, millions of dollars. But to really go on with the documentary, basically they go away from the E. coli, the leafy greens and all that, and really go more into the eggs, the chickens, as well as the salmonella part of the industry. And basically it kind of summed it up as there are about two big, corporations that are in charge of breeding, which is Cobb and I think Avion. I think that's how you say it. Sorry if I butcher that. And as well as the hatcheries, which is Tyson, Purdue, Pilgrim, and Sanderson. And so as they set the story up more and more and more, they also talk about the movement to go away from antibiotics in chicken, which a lot of producers use to get rid of a lot of diseases and stuff within chickens. And because they started moving away from this, they had to really just think of different ways on how to keep the chickens safe and not get the chickens tainted and stuff. And so from there, they go on this whole little journey with one of the Purdue farms, I believe it was Purdue, basically looking at, when the eggs are created or when the embryos are created, they try their best to test out the eggs before they go into the hatcheries and then hatch. And as the chicken are being fed, growing, developing before they be, slaughtered, basically they're being tested for salmonella, they're being tested for E. coli, they're being tested on a regular basis. And so before I make my next point to what happens in the slaughterhouses, I want to remind y'all that USDA and FDA, even though they're regulatory bodies and they have some enforcement abilities, they have no actual jurisdiction or oversight on what happens on the actual farms unless there's an actual outbreak that takes place and gets reported. And one of the things that Advocate says throughout this whole documentary is say that, that's not really, effective because, for one, the best way you can prevent all this stuff from happening, from diseases actually getting the food supply, is actually cracking on stuff that happened in the farm, having more day-to-day oversight and getting more federal involvement in that. And they obviously know that's not going to happen because, the businesses want the government out their business, free enterprise and all that. But the second thing that happens in this film, which I'm a little shocked but not really surprised, is that a actual USDA inspector who worked in a chicken plant with other USDA inspectors breaks down what really goes down in these plants and why the way that they do things in inspections is not working. Because typically how birds are inspected in the plant is that there's one inspector on each line, at the end of each line, that are inspecting the chicken as they go by. About 300,000 birds go through the lines, according to the documentary, of course. When they go through the lines each day, it's really easy to miss even the most obvious of details of something wrong with the bird. This inspector also lists many other gross details, such as the workers don't wash their hands after using the restroom or coming back from lunch. They don't, clean the birds. They put the birds in the chillers and get, feces on it. they do a lot of different, grotesque things that they don't adhere to regulations as well as safety and hygiene standards. As well as USDA inspectors are only supposed to look at the physical quality of each bird and not really test each bird for salmonella, for E. coli, or for any other pathogen that can cause harm to our bodies. As stated in a documentary, this inspector said that they only test the birds about 5 times a month out of the millions of birds that go through the line, every month. And so it's real easy to miss a, outbreak in that step. And that doesn't even talk about when the outbreaks get out into the American public, how easy it is for it to spread, because this documentary highlighted how easy it is to cross-contaminate and how, within the span of 5 minutes, you can touch about 5 to 20 different things in your house. Now everything got infected with salmonella. Now you got to clean off everything. And just by the way some of y'all acted during the pandemic, I understand why we're still in year 3 of the pandemic, which is why many people in this film has been trying to lobby the USDA to make salmonella an adulterant in all meats. And while salmonella has been made an adulterous in breaded meats and all that, we still have to understand that it's still a threat. And at the end of the day, the USDA has always stated that salmonella is on the onus of the consumer to make sure they cook the food well, to make sure they prepare well, to make sure they can stop the spread. When in fact, there are ways you can prevent this from happening on a farm. But like I said, with capitalist America, they keep wanting to do things in the cheapest and fastest way possible that makes them the most money. And of course, they're not going to sign on to salmonella being an adulterant for all meats. And to really talk about the gross indifference of corporate America, we had a Purdue spokesperson that was featured in a documentary. And basically, throughout this documentary, they were taking tests of different chickens and stuff from the different, hatcheries. And basically, in one test where they tested 5 chickens, they basically found one of them that was infected with salmonella from Purdue. And basically, when they brought that to the interview, he was just like, well, that was only 1 out of 5. It's not fair to really judge us on that mark. You need a higher mark. And basically, the producer was just like, how high? And so what ended up happening, they decided to test about 150 chickens because that was the mark that the guy said. And when the results came back, it found out about 17%, which is almost about 30 chickens in a bunch, came back with salmonella. And about 30% of those infected chickens were from Purdue. And basically, when they reached back out to the sponsor of the video or the spokesperson of the video, whoever at Purdue, basically they said, well, that's generally the standard of the industry. Like, I think we're doing pretty well. We've been trying our best to hamper down on it, but we're pretty much within standards. And this is why it's important that we have different advocates outside the federal government, including lobbyists too, to really advocate for changes, not only on behalf of the victims, but on behalf of the American people, because 30% of your chicken from Purdue might be infected with salmonella at this moment. Now, going more in depth in the documentary, it talks about the food lobbyists, the big, dark money behind why we can't have common sense laws for food safety. Basically, they brought in this doctor, I think Mindy Brashear. Basically, she was the USDA secretary under President Donald Trump. She was appointed. And basically, she has a background of doing, research into the beef industry as well as many different aspects of the beef industry, which I'm going to list in this video. And the way they brought her in was very much hilarious because they brought her in. She was like, I was happy I was picked. I'm more of a facts-based person. I'm a science-based person. I get to the hard details. I'm very unbiased when it comes to my work. But basically, after she was done speaking, the interviewer just stopped her and said, hey, didn't you receive X amount from the National Cattle Beef Association and for all these other sources and stuff too? And basically, Dr. Bradshaw was saying like, well, we get different resources from our research and, we just, use it to make, the cattle industry safer. That's how research goes, which I kind of understand her response because when it comes to university research, like, you might be getting millions of dollars, but that millions and $1 million can only stretch so much. The way they kind of exposed her was kind of funny because after she said that, they literally got a line item list of different funding sources where her research has been funded by. And basically, she got about, I think, $4 million from the National Cattle Beef Association, whatever the name is. And so I get what she's trying to say with, she got to get her money from somewhere because, like I said, I understand. But it's kind of interesting that, you're getting money from one of the biggest lobbying groups in America when we talk about, cattlemen and, ranchers and, corporate interests and all that. And even as many advocates, including U.S. Representative Rosa DeLauro, who just recently introduced a bill for better food safety standards in the food system of America, are trying to push these things, the food industry, as well as like the cattlemen, ranchers, all that. They're basically trying to push back, saying like, well, you're making it more expensive. Now we got to charge consumers more. Now it's going to be more expensive on us. We got to scale back operations. We might got to lay off some people, lay off workers. Basically the same lame-o excuses capitalists have been saying for years and years and years. But one of the biggest narratives that they try to push is that it's very much impossible to get rid of all disease on farms and have these prevention efforts. But for the reality of the situation, Europe has already done this. And basically they have a lot more efforts that have been highlighted in the documentary too on, trying to prevent this from ever getting to the food system. Basically they have, mass vaccinations. They have veterinary programs, national programs like that. And basically they do their best to really just prevent this in, the population. While in the U.S., we leave a lot of those activities up to the corporations. At the end of the day, they were able to bring their national cases of salmonella from 200,000 in about the early 2000s to now being about 90,000 cases. And yet again, Europe is giving us the blueprint of what we need to do in America. We just too cocky not to take it, And it's, it's sad because now you're not only just talking about losing money in the economy, but you're really putting people's lives at stake. The American perception of, salmonella, E. coli, oh, you just have a stomach bug, you just got food poisoning, you'll be fine. Just spend a night in the hospital, you'll be fine. But literally, it can give you dehydration. It can really mess up your kidneys and other organs. And going back to Stephanie, like I said earlier in this whole review, she potentially might lose her kidney, and there's a good chance that she'll be on dialysis for the rest of her life. Like, just imagine you going to McDonald's, getting you a Happy Meal, take one wrong bite out of the burger, and basically you end up in the hospital. You got brain damage, you got kidney damage, and you basically, the rest of your life, is altered. Like, that's something that we don't really take seriously when we talk about, what we consume in America. And it's just one of those things that, we shouldn't have to really be concerned with it, because capitalists need to stop being greedy and really just do the best they need to do to prevent these things. But with that being said, that's my review of Poisoned. If you like this new little series I'm doing, keep liking, subscribing, all that wonderful good stuff. Share this video out with everybody else. I implore y'all to go watch the extra documentary. While this was a brief review of my thoughts on it, I want to really just implore you to support, the documentary. They did good work with this one. I implore you to go watch my last video about gun violence right here. Definitely implore y'all go like it up, watch it up, all this good stuff. Definitely I'm trying to make more of that content as well. But with that being said, stay very frosty, especially if you're in the South, because it's definitely hot out in Texas. And peace out.